Thank you, Maureen. So I'm happy to be here, and I want to also welcome you all again this morning. So today's first talk will be about nutrition education in terms of theory and strategies during the first 1,000 days. I'd like to acknowledge the co-author of the subsequent publication, Dr. Saavedra, of whom is also my colleague, and two contributors from the US, of whom have been very dedicated to developing nutrition materials during the first 1,000 days. Three objectives of the talk today. First off, let's review some of the current statistics on what are the prevalence of underweight and overweight to describe healthy growth. We'll find that there's very limited data for the less than 2-year-age population. Secondly, we'll define nutrition education in terms of theory. And then lastly, take a look at, thank you, Natalia. Lastly, I'll go over some of the most recent studies in the field, and we can identify what some of the gaps are and some next steps. So let's start with what we know about older children, age 5 to 19 years of age. So here we see that in the past 40 years, the prevalence of obesity and high BMI has increased in both boys and girls. So I don't know if you can read the values on the y-axis, but in 1975, there were about 5 million obese girls. In 2016, that value was tenfold, 50 million obese girls. For boys, in 1975, when the data was first available, there were 6 million obese boys. 2 years ago, there were 74 million. For underweight statistics, and this is both severe and moderately severe underweight, there certainly has been an increase, but the increase is much smaller than the increase in what you see for obesity. What's most concerning here is if you look at the color codes, and you see that there's both an increase and high prevalence of underweight and overweight in the yellow, red, and orange categories, which are mainly in some countries of Africa, South Asia, and a little bit of Middle Eastern countries too. So the dual burden of both underweight and overweight is affecting many countries at very high rates. Now, we don't have too much for children that are less than 5 years of age. There is a few WHO statistics. Mostly this is from 3 to 5 years of age, not so much from birth to 2 years. And here, although this data was reported from a 2014 data set, if we look at some of these individual countries, values are increasing. So the World Health Organization did come up with a monograph in 2016. And this was one of the first times that the words infant and obesity were used in the same page and same publication. Of this monograph, there were 6 identified recommendations for addressing prevention of obesity. And here, let's take a look at this quote. The established global guidance for infant and young child feeding has primarily targeted undernutrition, and that has been one of the WHO goals. But guidelines that address both undernutrition and obesity risk are clearly needed for countries where the malnutrition is in all of its forms. So this was an important addition to this field of recognizing that infant obesity is as problematic as underweight and stunting and severe malnutrition. In the US, the Institute of Medicine also published a document a few years earlier with recommendations regarding early childhood obesity prevention policies. 2 recommendations are here for you. One is that in the US, healthcare providers should measure weight and length of all children from birth to 24 months at every well child visit. That's about every 2 months in the US. And then secondly, that healthcare professionals should consider some risk factors, such as weight for length or body mass index greater than the 85th percentile, not at the 95th or 97.5th percentile, which is clearly frank obesity, but let's take a look earlier at the 85th percentile, and also rate of weight gain, especially in the first 4 to 6 months, rate of weight gain. These 2 factors are independently associated with latter childhood overweight and obesity, which tends to track into adolescence, which tends to track into adulthood, and the cycle continues. In the US, there are few statistics on children that are less than 2 years of age for height, weight, and length. We were unable to identify any global statistics for children less than 2 years of age, or the first, from birth to 2 years, the end of the first 1,000 days. In the US, we did identify these recent values. However, they all look at obesity at greater than 2 standard deviations from the mean, which would be out on the 95th or 97th percentile. So these children are clearly at the top or the bottom of the curve. There's one nationally representative sample here. It's the first one with an N of 584. It was published in 2014, and the data set is basically a 2012 data set. And here, overall, there was about 8% of the children that reached this high level of obesity. The following 3 statistics are large N studies, and these are essentially with low-income children in the United States. Now, it's important for me to mention that in the United States, in 2017, the American Academy of Pediatrics reported that 53% of infants from birth to 1 year of age participate in the Women, Infant, and Children program. It goes by the acronym of WIC. It's a subsidized nutrition program with an education component. So it's a nutrition education plus subsidized program. So even though these latter 3 statistics are not nationally representative, they certainly cover at least half of the very young children in the United States. So overall, we have an incidence or prevalence of obesity in the youngest children from about 8 up to 17.5%, which is quite alarming. So we do know how to start to address this. So we have these most vulnerable children in this early stage of life. We know that weight at this point tracks, and all of its health consequences track with these children. So modifiable factors associated with healthy growth of these young children have been identified. Some of the first work was done in 2012. It was one of the systematic reviews done in 2012, and since that time, there's been at least 6 additional systematic reviews. The answers have been consistently the same. Authors have categorized what are some of these modifiable factors that we can address to start to curb this overweight and obesity path that these young children are on. Now, what has been most recently added is on the top here, the optimization of maternal health in preparation for pregnancy. And one of our speakers this morning will address the preconception importance phase to get babies even started on a healthy track before conception. Otherwise, we'll look at food and diet-related factors, and I'm sure by now you could have scanned through the list, and then some feeding behavior-related factors. We'll revisit these again before we're finished here. And I also want to point out that although I have been focusing on obesity prevention in children, the modifiable factors for infant healthy growth are really no different if we're talking about underweight prevention. So looking at what the WHO, this is back in 2002, when underweight prevention was still a top priority. Obesity wasn't mentioned back in those days. The WHO guiding principles on the left-hand side of the screen are very detailed, but if you were to condense them, you would get to what's on the right-hand side of the screen, exactly aligned with what we showed for the obesity prevention. So this is where nutrition education comes in. And clearly, to address both sides of the spectrum here of healthy growth and development, nutrition education can play a major role. So let me provide to you the definition on the Society for Nutrition Education and Behavior webpage. This is their homepage. It's one of the largest societies in the States with global membership as well. And the goal is to support nutrition education and nutrition educators through workshops to support research, policy statements, and And although there's really no one international definition of nutrition education, this is the one that is most widely accepted. So here, nutrition education is a combination of educational strategies with environmental supports to facilitate voluntary adoption of food choices, other food nutrition-related behaviors for health and well-being. And also, nutrition education can be delivered through multiple venues, as identified here, at the individual, community, and policy levels. So what are some of the goals of nutrition education? And immediately the question is it to provide information? Well, I provided information, but there's no change in the behavior of the mom. So dissemination of information is not the same as nutrition education. So if we were to provide the top 5 reasons that moms breastfeed, that's information. To get that into nutrition education, we need to identify a behavior. And the goal is for the behavior to change. So people ask, well, can nutrition education just have a goal of increasing knowledge? And that's fine. Of course, we need knowledge in order to make some behavior change. But knowledge does not necessarily relate to behavior change. Some ask, what about, is it a way to change people's ways of thinking? And certainly, if we consider attitudes or judgments, ways of thinking about something, are prerequisites for a behavior change, yes, that's another piece of nutrition education, but ultimately the goal is to change or adopt a behavior. A shortened description is here in the middle part of the slide, and educational approaches designed to promote food and nutrition-related behaviors. So again, that's what we're after. All behaviors begin with an action, and here we can either strive for a behavior change, which might be a holistic preconception change, increased lifestyle with activity and change in diet, or it might be to adopt a new behavior during pregnancy or certainly after the baby's born. Carrying on here, how does nutrition education work? It's a process. And the first step in this process is identifying which behavior is the target. So after one of the behaviors is identified, that is, let's say, the focus of the intervention, it's important to take a look at the mediating variables. These are things that precede somebody moving toward making the behavior change. And these mediating variables can be measured. That's why they're variables. If they were constructs, it would be something a little bit too vague that wouldn't be measured. So here we call them variables. And there's many variables that we can measure. For example, there's breastfeeding attitude scales that have been previously validated. We can measure beliefs about responsive feeding, barriers to breastfeeding, multiple publications, social norms, usually looking at socio-economic or demographics of a particular population, widely available, and even self-efficacy, the confidence that somebody can perform a specific behavior. There are tools and these can be measured. So if we look at these particular variables, they should influence the target behavior, which can be one of many, but here we just give a few examples for the first 1,000 days. And then the ultimate outcome should be healthy growth. So one more theoretical slide here. In order for a behavior to be adopted, it requires 2 phases. One is motivation, and the second is the ability to take action. And here's listed some constructs, just because these are more difficult to measure. There really aren't any good validated tools for most of these constructs or concepts or ideas. But to motivate an individual toward making a behavior change or adoption, we need to consider somebody's beliefs or judgments about that behavior. What are the expectations that the individual has? And if you consider the expectations and the value that somebody puts on that, in combination, they basically make a judgment. Perception of personal risk is something else that can be a motivational construct. So here, let's use a breastfeeding example. If a mother has a strong family history of allergy, and she feels very susceptible that her baby would indeed have allergy, she might be more motivated to breastfeed. But if she doesn't really think that the severity of allergy is all that important, it would decrease her motivation. Also, we have to also consider some of the social norms of the individual. And these two can be changed, and they can be adopted towards more desirable social norms if need be the case. Looking at the ability to take action, these are things like behavioral capability, which is essentially knowledge. This is the nutrition ed speak for knowledge, is behavioral capability. The intention to perform a behavior is necessary before somebody does it, of course. Self-regulation would be things like goal setting and tracking, and finally self-efficacy. Increasing self-efficacy can move somebody more toward a behavior change. All of this has to be considered within an environmental framework: family, social support, and let's not forget about accessibility to food, which is critical in some of our lower socioeconomic status populations. I want to mention self-efficacy because on the next slide after this one, we'll see that it is involved in all of the theories and models. And this is probably one of the most frequently used constructs in nutrition education. So folks ask, how can we enhance self-efficacy? First of all, for a quick definition, it's the confidence to perform a specific behavior, okay, fine, but it's in various situations and in the face of various barriers. For example, with breastfeeding, somebody may have high self-efficacy that they can breastfeed in the hospital, lower self-efficacy or confidence they can breastfeed at home, and absolutely no confidence that they'll be able to breastfeed once going back to work. So it's not a one-shot scale. It varies with time and looking at various barriers. So some ways that self-efficacy can be enhanced or built is one is social modeling, observing others similar to oneself performing the behavior. Again, if we talk about breastfeeding, some moms have never seen another woman breastfeed. Simply offering a video of a woman actively breastfeeding that looks like her, the culture is similar to her, the housing is similar to her, the skin color is similar to her. Just by showing somebody that I'm like you and I can do it can help increase confidence that the mother as well can be successful. Social persuasion is really important. And just recently, in 2017, in Hong Kong, a large study, about 1,200 families, it was shown that for every additional family member who preferred breastfeeding, there was a 32% increase in the mom's desire to breastfeed and her commitment to an intention to breastfeed. So one of our speakers will also mention later about influence of family and fathers. Actually, there's some new apps out there on dads supporting breastfeeding. So mastery experiences is simply practicing the behavior. And often, we make it either all or none. Well, let's try the behavior. If a mom feels like she can't breastfeed, give it a try. It doesn't have to be 100% successful, and absolutely practice can make perfect here. And then self-regulation. These are skills that can be taught about goal setting, about self-monitoring, and about solving problems. Ultimately, we want the woman of whom is breastfeeding to be able to have the confidence that she can make a plan for when she goes back to work, how to continue to breastfeed. So the last slide on this section about the nutrition education theory here looks at three. And these three are historically the most often used and currently the most often used. So first is this health belief model, and it proposes that readiness to take action is based on beliefs. And this all makes good sense. So some examples of beliefs that would be important to explore in a first 1,000 days nutrition education program are things here listed that we've seen time and time again. A belief that a larger baby is a healthier baby, that young children will outgrow their overweight, that only the parent knows how much the baby needs to eat, that the baby possibly couldn't have that self-regulation skill. And the way to find these kind of health beliefs is with search of the literature or preferably a focus group with the population that is planning to be studied. Theory of planned behavior goes one step farther into this, and it shows or proposes that behaviors are determined by intentions, which are influenced by attitudes, social norms, and perception of control. Here, there's multiple studies showing that using this theory of planned behavior does help statistically increase the likelihood of success within these interventions. So it's linked with breastfeeding, timing of comp feeding. And lastly, the social cognitive theory right now is the most frequently used nutrition education theory. It continues to build on the previous two. However, the social cognitive theory adds environment, and the environment cannot be overlooked. So here we see that behaviors are a result of personal behavior and environmental factors. And these environmental factors can be the physical environment, the family environment, socioeconomic environment, or the environment of limited accessibility to healthy food. These theories have been applied to multiple studies of various modifiable factors in the first 1,000 days. Overall, the literature strongly suggests that using one of these theories increase odds of success with an intervention trial compared to studies that don't. If you put them all together, you can come up with a diagram that looks something like this. And even for folks of whom are not involved in active intervention research, I think one advantage of considering this type of approach could be used in a clinical setting as well. It differentiates the provision of information versus looking at factors that actually influence whether or not somebody is going to adopt a behavior. So just the terminology here of attitudes, perceived risk, self-efficacy, these kinds of terms can be applied in multiple settings. So does this work? And yes, the short answer is absolutely. So here I'm providing some data on one of the most recent meta-analyses for breastfeeding education. There's been many, but this one is in press, and I thought we might as well just go ahead and take the most recent. This is a very well done meta-analysis with a strong search strategy. And here you can see there was over 700 breastfeeding education papers first identified. Over 200 met the initial inclusion criteria, were read, and then 20 were selected through additional hand searching, reading references, and tracing down additional studies, a final pool of 32. Very strong relative risks. So here we can see that compared to women who did not have breastfeeding education, women who did have breastfeeding education were 40% more likely to continue with breastfeeding and to initiate breastfeeding. This is kind of in the middle of the other two more recently published meta-analyses. One showed that there was a relative risk of 16, so women who were provided breastfeeding education were 16 times more likely to continue, and another one was even a little bit stronger. So with breastfeeding, certainly this works. What are in some of these breastfeeding education studies? This is quite a nice study from the US. It's getting a bit dated now, but and the reason that this is quite helpful is it shows at what month moms stopped breastfeeding. So this can help target an intervention. So certainly the lactational factors, early on, those are going to be the most critical. And you can see that the prevalence of the reasons why moms stop breastfeeding for lactational factors in the first month are much stronger than at month 6 to 8. But then some of the psychosocial factors didn't kick in until about 2 or 3 or 4 months throughout the breastfeeding journey. So that would be the time to introduce those into an education program. The nutritional factors were consistent. And clearly what we see, not only in the US, but in multiple countries around the world, is that the number 1, 2, and 3 reasons moms report stopping breastfeeding is breast milk alone did not satisfy my baby, I didn't have enough milk, and I had trouble latching. So we used this exact same survey and asked it to about 900 women in Greece, Belgium, and in the Netherlands to compare if this was just a unique US phenomenon, or would we get same results from just some selected European countries. And indeed, we got very similar results. The top 3 reasons remain the same. What was interesting and a new learning to us, and in developing breastfeeding education programs, this last factor of breastfeeding was too tiring. It didn't show up very strongly in the US, but it did so in Belgium and in the Netherlands. So baby cannot live on breast milk alone after 6 months. So we need to look at some of the other modifiable factors that influence healthy growth and development. And the question is, well, what about nutrition education looking at these factors? Does it matter? Does nutrition education work? And again, the answer is a resounding yes. And there's multiple studies addressing each one of these factors here. And if we put these factors into an action or a target behavior, it's even easier to ask the research question, what does the research support that if we use a nutrition education intervention or not, will we reach the target behavior? And again, clearly, they all have support. So again, one of our colleagues will talk about adjusted energy intake or expenditure to meet weight gain recommendations, nutrient density during lactation. And another one of our colleagues will speak about offering nutritious complementary foods and beverages at the appropriate developmental stage. We've already talked about breastfeeding. The responsive feeding literature comes up often as a significant factor in some of these education programs. One that is less often studied right now as an independent variable is physical activity, TV time, screen time, because we're talking about very young children. And then lastly, about sleep. And sleep does too come up very often. So when we look at what are a combination of all of the previous factors and survey the literature for RCTs with these multi-component interventions that have weight outcomes, where do we land? And right now, there are 16 independent cohort studies that have looked at least 2 to 3 of the factors that we have identified as modifiable, and that did meet the criteria of being an RCT study and providing some kind of weight, adiposity, or BMI outcome. They all were published in the last 7.5 years. Over 7 countries, there were 7 different types of delivery, from clinic, community, home-based, combination clinic plus home. One study now has been published that had a Facebook plus clinic intervention. One of the largest studies here is the one that I identify here with over 2,000 participants, or mother-infant dyads, and it had a clinic plus online intervention type. So the world is evolving, and this is a good thing, because when you consider how many babies can be reached and the expense of doing these trials in clinics and in home and in the community, the reach is very low. So to really scale up, if we look at some of the digital programs, we might be able to answer some of these questions more quickly. And we did this. So we looked first off at what are some of the infant feeding websites and apps that are just out there that are available. And some colleagues in Australia took this on. And looking through 2014, they collected they identified over 600 websites and over 2,800 apps that had keywords such as infant feeding, baby feeding, breastfeeding, the traditional kind of systematic literature review. And unfortunately, when they assessed these both apps and websites, the quality was very poor. They used tools that are known and have been used for other medical website evaluation. Overall, about half of both the apps and the websites were so poor in quality that they were eliminated and they were recommended to be eliminated. So some of the criteria were very simple things like the usability, did it actually work? But also in terms of a content evaluation. Many of the apps had no references, did not disclose who the authors were, the funding source. There were no release statements that the mother would sign. So this is kind of a natural experiment here that we've got going with all of these apps are present. And then, well, let's take a look at the few studies that have used digital approach, either web-based app or mHealth, mobile health design approach, in the first 1,000 days that looked at outcomes. They didn't look at things like how many clicks or how many likes or how many followers, but they looked at true clinical outcomes, and so there's not been many. First off, there was a systematic review of lifestyle and medical apps during pregnancy, over approximately 2,500 apps addressing pregnancy alone. Only 4 of them showed significant effects in terms of weight, diet, smoking. And surprisingly, the N on most of these studies was quite low, so they didn't have the statistical power to reach significance. Secondly, if we look at breastfeeding, there's clear promise here. And a systematic review and meta of over, well, originally about 1,800 studies down after inclusion criteria to 16. And these studies were either web or text messaging. Even text messaging alone seemed to have a significant influence on initiation and exclusivity of breastfeeding at 4 to 6 months. E-prompts, CD-ROMs, any kind of electronic media. So this is one area that does seem to show promise. And then lastly, this is a new study out of Australia that compared a web or a mobile phone approach intervention. It was a multi-component intervention with young children. They enrolled third trimester up to 15 weeks, with ends, as you can see, about 300 per each. Unfortunately, the study was not successful in terms of efficacy of change of weight. There was a follow-up study that did find one responsive feeding question on one of the surveys did reach statistical significance, but I think we shouldn't be too disappointed. It's a start. And the authors report this is the very first study that has used a complete digital approach to try to address some of these modifiable factors for healthy growth and development. And there's at least 26 protocol studies in the works. There's a number of feasibility studies that are just being published. And I think it's time that we look towards this digital approach to nutrition education. It appears feasible. There's still a lot of work to be done, but at least we could scale up and reach many more of these most young and vulnerable children. With this, I conclude that healthy growth statistics are limited for children less than 2 years of age, and we really need to take a look at why this is and when they will be coming out. Nutrition education is clearly well defined. The goal is for behavior adoption or behavior change, starting with identifying a target behavior, looking at the mediating variables, moving on to motivation and ability to change variables, applying a theory, and if all goes well, then there should be behavior change or adoption. There are multiple nutrition education theories and strategies that have been employed to the modifiable factors identified. The effect sizes are limited. Incorporating nutrition education into scale-up digital interventions is viable. It's just not yet been proven totally effective. And with that, I thank you very much. And I think we have some time for questions.